My opinion, the biggest counter-majoritarian institution is the US Senate. I understand why it was originally created. It was meant to balance power between the bigger states and the smaller states. But today it actually works against democratic equality. From what we read in chapters 4 through 6, democracy is supposed to reflect the will of the majority. But the Senate doesn't really do that in practice. The main issue is representation. Every state gets two senators no matter how big or small its population. So basically, smaller states end up having way more power per person than larger states. For example, someone living in a smaller state like Delaware has much more influence in the Senate than someone living in a highly populated state like California or New York. The textbook explains this as a representation imbalance, where not all votes carry the same weight, even though democracy is supposed to be based on political equality. Another big problem is the filibuster, which we talked about in the lectures and in the book. This rule allows a minority of senators to block legislation unless there are 60 votes. So even if a majority of people, and even if a majority of elected officials support a policy, it can still fail. That makes it really hard for the government to actually respond to what most people want, which kind of defeats the purpose of a democracy. This also connects to something else from the readings, which is how institutions can shape outcomes. Even if elections are fair, the structure of the system can still prevent majority rule. The Senate is a really strong example of that because it gives extra power to certain groups and makes it easier for minorities to block change. In terms of reform, I think there are some realistic options, but also some that are basically impossible. For example, removing or reforming the filibuster is actually possible because it's just a Senate rule. If that changed, laws could pass with a simple majority, which would make the system more democratic and responsive. But changing the structure of the Senate itself, like giving states representation based on population, is extremely unlikely. The Constitution protects equal representation for states, and according to what we learn in the readings, it's one of the hardest things to change. Smaller states would never agree to give up that power, so there's just a huge political barrier. I think the biggest obstacle to reform is self interest. The people who benefit from the current system don't want to change it. And on top of that, political polarization makes compromise even harder, which we've seen come up in both the lectures and discussions. So, overall, even though the Senate was designed to create fairness and stability, today it actually acts as one of the biggest obstacles to majority rule. Small reforms like changing the filibuster might help, but larger structural changes are probably not realistic because of constitutional limits and political resistance.